And just to let folks know, as you come into the room, we'll start the slides at a couple minutes after 8:30. And as you're coming in and getting settled in, feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat with where you're joining us from. And if you know whose traditional lands you're on, it's always interesting to see that as well. And good morning, everyone. It's Wednesday, it's the middle of the week, and we're going to get rolling. I'm Barb Chamberlain. My pronouns are she, her. I'm the director of the Active Transportation Division at the Washington State Department of Transportation. Welcome to the Washington Bike Walk and Roll Summit presented by Amazon. We're excited to have the number of registrants going up each day. We now have over 600 people registered for this 5-day virtual event. We'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. This summit is virtual, and you who are participating are joining us from many lands. We want to acknowledge the land Cascade Bicycle Club sits on today as the traditional home of the Duwamish, Tulalip, Muckleshoot, and Suquamish tribal nations. If you don't know whose lands you're on, look in the chat in a minute, and I'll drop a link to a map you can use to look up your place on the land. Without them, we would not have access to this environment. We take the opportunity to thank the original caretakers of this land who are still here. We'd also like to note that we are recording this session, and it will be available following the summit. The summit is hosted by Cascade Bicycle Club and Washington Bikes, two sister statewide organizations with a shared vision of bicycling for all. Cascade serves riders of all, educating new riders, advocating for safe places to ride, and holding events and rides. Washington Bikes advocates for bicyclists' rights, endorses political candidates, holds officials accountable, and works to shape policies that will make bicycling safe and accessible for all. We want to take a minute to thank our sponsors whose collective contributions have enabled us to bring together 15 panels with expert speakers and registration free for all participants. Thanks so much to Amazon, our presenting sponsor. We also thank our supporting sponsors, the Washington State Department of Transportation Active Transportation Division in Eastern Washington region. And thanks also to our general sponsors, the Department of Transportation, Federal Highways Administration, and Stacey Bain Bike Lawyers. With that, and before we transition to introducing this summit session, we want to take a moment to articulate the community expectations we have for all the sessions. We'll maintain a standard of conduct to ensure that all participants feel safe and respected. We believe every person has the right to be treated with dignity and respect and to be free from all forms of harassment. We ask that you are fully present in this session. Be self-responsible and self-challenging. Listen, 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 and process. Suspend judgment of yourself and others, and use respectful language towards each other and the panel. I will now quickly introduce our panelists and the topic, and this will be a great technical session. Get prepared for a fast, deep dive on network analysis, the concepts and data that make it possible to bike, walk, and roll door to door. Our panelists today are Kim Voros with Alta Planning, Brian Wood, my colleague at WSDOT Active Transportation Division, and Chris Comeau with the City of Bellingham. We'll be talking about the network analysis tool that we developed for the upcoming Active Transportation Plan, which will be out for comment later this winter. And it gives us a quantitative evaluation of infrastructure quality and completeness. So Kim will be talking with us about the concepts and the data that went into it. Brian will talk about that and how we're using it and our new methodology for looking at where we need more highway crossings. And Chris will be sharing his work in Bellingham with similar principles. How do we apply all of this in local and regional plans so that we can get networks that really cross boundaries? And there we go. So our format will be, we'll do this introductory period. We're going to have the presentation. This will actually go a little bit past the 1 hour time frame that's been typical of the other sessions because there is so much content. So feel free to drop your questions into the chat. And I want to thank Kim, Brian, and Chris for being with us this morning. And with that, I think Kim is possibly up first.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Barb. I'm just going to take over screen share. And we'll confirm that I did this right here. And it looks like I did. One more piece here. Okay, thanks. I have part one of a two-part presentation. Brian Wood will be talking about and expanding upon the concepts that I'm going to talk about. The goal of this presentation is to talk about how the new Active Transportation Plan considers planning from a network perspective and introduces two main quantitative tools that are the foundation of the network analysis. So the 2008 Active Transportation Plan made policy statements and listed project needs, but it really didn't talk about networks from a complete network perspective. So when you want to think about networks, this seems intuitive, but let's stop and break this down for a minute. What is a network? In our case, it is accessible, interconnected transportation facilities that allow people to get to where they want to go. And when you think about it, that would look like this. This is a network. It's made up of links and nodes, where links are the streets or trails, and they are linear facilities that people travel along. Nodes would be intersections or places where people can hop from one trail or intersection to another. What you can see on the screen here is a perfectly connected network, like we would see in an urban setting every day. When we get in a car or hop on a bus, we have an expectation that the driver, whoever they are, has the choice about what route they'll take, and they'll pick the best route or the optimal route based on factors like time of day, type of trip. Do we need to take the freeway, for example, and will that make things faster? So much of our reality looks like this. This is a bicycle network. And when I say bicycle network, you can use pedestrian network in there too, or a network for rolling, but I'll use cycling or bicycling for shorthand here. Our typical bicycle network is likely to have gaps, and I am sure that you have experienced these in the wild. This is also a bicycle network. This one is also a bicycle network, and when we get to this point, the network is fragmented, or it really doesn't even look like a network. We take for granted oftentimes that today's roadways networks are often complete and built out, but we're in a different stage of planning and construction for bicycle and pedestrian networks. And we sometimes take for granted, I know I do as an active transportation practitioner, that our job is really twofold. One of these is to build a complete network, and then two is to make it usable for all people, because we know that not all roads, bikes, sidewalks, trails, rolling facilities are created equal. So we have to catch up to where the motor vehicle networks are. Given that, it makes sense that we want to use a expanded or more precise definition of a network. Which fortunately the FHWA has provided us with. This is taken from the Guidebook for Measuring Multimodal Connectivity. And this is an accessible, interconnected transportation network of bicycle and pedestrian facilities that allow users to safely and conveniently get to where they want to go. So in terms of network development, this definition considers both the reality of where we are and the aspiration of where we want to get. If we want to make walking, cycling, and rolling a viable choice for people to take as many trips as possible. Oh, too many slides there. This guide, which you saw mentioned or referenced on the previous slide, gives us some network design principles and a way to talk about the network. These concepts are baked into how many people understand a motor vehicle network to work. As planners, citizens, and advocates, I know that I'm guessing that you've seen many of these words talked about when we talk about networks. How complete are they? How dense are they? Thinking about networks holistically using this framework lets us talk about networks in a really nuanced way. So let's break these down. You can see here on this slide a short definition. We have completeness, which describes network comprehensiveness. And you can see that there's a little diagram at the bottom, reading from left to right, that illustrates the concept. Density of the network defines the relative number of links or facilities. Directness defines whether or not out-of-direction travel is required to access a destination. Access describes whether a specific destination can be reached via the network. And quality really defines the user experience. Is it stressful? Is it blissful? Are the roadways high stress? So thinking about this, you can have one of these elements or even several of these elements in a network, but they aren't necessarily all represented. You can have a network that's dense but indirect, or a network that's high quality but doesn't get people to where they want to go. So this is important because counts don't tell the whole story. Holistically and historically, the ATP has relied on counts and assessments of demand to drive bicycle facility selection and where facilities will be constructed. One example of where counts didn't tell the whole story was the 520 bridge. And Brian, I'll ask you to elaborate here if you want when you talk. There was the 520 bridge. There were not counts available because the facility didn't exist. It was constructed anyway, and today it's one of WSDOT's highest use facilities. So what that indicates is that you can't always rely on counts to understand where the demand is. Therefore, if we start looking at networks and where facilities need to be built to get people where they want to go, that will give us a more nuanced understanding and a better chance of building a comprehensive, collected bicycle and pedestrian network. So identifying these network deficiencies is really an important part of demonstrating need, is the take-home message that we're conveying here. And the Washington State ATP, one of the things that it strives to do is establish an understanding of existing conditions throughout Washington along the state highway network in identifying gaps and potential improvements. So WSDOT considers this in two ways. They want to consider travel along the state highway network and then the ability to cross the state highway network. We did that through a consideration of links, which is along, and the tool that was used to assess travel along roadways is level of traffic stress. Level of traffic stress is a scale of network facility quality that is numbered numerically 1 through 4, with LTS 1 being the lowest, LTS 4 being the highest, and that corresponds to lowest stress facilities and highest stress facilities. The methods are grounded in a guide that was released by the Minetta Transportation Institute in 2012. There are various flavors and adaptations of LTS that are used. The adaptation for WSDOT included context, number of roadway lanes, presence of bike lanes, presence of shoulders, and traffic volumes. This is a picture of what roadway sections might look like if you are considering LTS 1, LTS 2, LTS 3, and LTS 4 roadways. And these are tied to Roger Geller's 4 types of cyclists, if you are familiar with that scale. Here's a quick visual reference. This is what LTS 1 through 4 roadways might look like in an urban setting. And these photos are taken from Seattle. And here are photos of what those same LTS 1 through 4 facilities might look like in a more rural setting. And these are taken from various locations in Eastern Washington. You can imagine that doing a statewide analysis with level of traffic stress was data intensive, and we discovered data limitations as we were moving through the analysis. Specifically, we wished we had bike lane widths, more detailed information on trails, and more information on sidewalk presence. There are other attributes that would give us a more nuanced ability to understand the network. Those might be parking and right turn lanes, but those can also be done at a more detailed level when you're looking at a corridor. So this is what we came up with, and this is just a draft map. This is not available yet. It's still in development by WSDOT. Barb mentioned the plan will be out for comment later this fall. We identified gaps as areas with a level of traffic score 3 and 4. This is, of course, first pass at understanding the need on the state highway system. And as mentioned, Brian will talk about how this slide that you see here was refined. We're going to touch on nodes really quickly, and that's across, how you get across the freeway. For this presentation, I'm referring to this concept as the highway barrier permeability test. It could also be referred to as the highway crossing stress test, or my favorite is the why does the chicken cross the road, or how hard is it for the cyclist to cross the road test. The purpose of this study, which contributed to the Active Transportation Plan, was to understand how hard or easy it is to cross roadways in the state highway system. What we used, the tool that was selected, is a route directness index. The definition of a route directness index is it considers the variation in a straight line distance via the network distance. So it measures out of direction travel. If you want to get from point A to point B and it's 1 mile in a straight line, and it is 4 miles via the roadway network, that means you have to go 4 times as long and 4 times out of direction to get to where you want to go, meaning it's very likely a trip that you are not going to make. What we did is we applied this route directness concept by slicing all of the state highways into 250-foot chunks and seeing how hard it was or whether you could even cross each various chunk of the freeway. So we could determine whether you could cross the road, and if you could cross the road, how easy or how hard that was. The results look something like this, where you can see the darker the color or closer to red the color is, the further out of direction you have to go to cross the freeway. And there are many locations where you can't even cross the freeway. Now, we did some preliminary visualization of this data, and we showed locations where there is a route directness index of greater or less than 2. For the sake of conversation and analysis in the Active Transportation Plan, we started to think about areas where route directness index is less than 2 as crossings that might viably be made. We know this isn't a perfect metric, but it is a place to start. And as a note, WSDOT has not adopted this study or an official policy behind the route directness index yet. Brian can speak to that, but it is definitely an exploratory study, which is working its way through the draft process. A couple of potential metrics have been explored as a part of the study. Average route directness of a roadway or a corridor or a county, average distance between crossing opportunities with that might viably be made, and that is where route directness index is less than 2, or an average RDI, which is mixed with level of traffic stress. So that was a whirlwind tour through the high-level concepts that Brian will be elaborating on in the next presentation. Thank you so much for your time. Brian, I'm going to stop screen sharing and take it away.
And remember to unmute yourself, Brian, the voice of the moderator.
Hello, and thank you for letting me share some of the ways WSDOT's using level of traffic stress to inform our developing active transportation plan. If I can just get this thing to show now. I think I got it. Share. All right, and I'll start the presentation. Okay, that didn't work. Start. There we go. Hopefully that's working for everybody. So let me start by saying that the early draft of our active transportation plan is rather large, which reflects the many new ways in which WSDOT is evaluating and thinking about our state system for walking and biking. This presentation will very briefly touch on the way level of traffic stress and highway crossing availability have shaped the plan. The first 5 slides in this presentation will look at how the concept of population center began to take shape as the active transportation plan developed, and how it was used to help us characterize statewide active transportation need in the locations of primary interest. Although population centers are where most people do most of their riding and walking, our active transportation plan team recognized that active travelers use roads all over the state. We spent some time in the plan bringing attention to the rural high-speed context and how we may need a different approach from level of traffic stress to address them. I have a couple of slides that briefly discuss that topic. Performance metrics are an important outcome of this plan because we need to measure our progress to see if we're headed in the right direction. I have a slide summarizing a subset of the metrics that rely on level of traffic stress data. And Kim mentioned WSDOT's highway crossing availability study, otherwise known as a route directness analysis. And the agency is still evaluating that data, but 2 performance metrics are likely to come out of it that would be included in the active transportation plan. Finally, I will touch on a concept that we identified in the plan as travel need and how it may help WSDOT in close cooperation with our local agency partners to start addressing the active transportation gaps. One of our first tasks in looking at level of traffic stress was to ask if we were highlighting the most important locations to consider along the state system. Population centers, also known as urban areas, were our primary focus. Our level of traffic stress methodology used speeds below 45 miles per hour and urban designation in an effort to capture communities where the concentration of destinations like homes, schools, and stores would be likely to make walking and biking more desirable. So we found that our method missed communities in some cases and extended beyond community boundaries in other cases. Here is the community of Lakeview near Soap Lake in Eastern Washington. It shows significant development, and there is definitely a case to be made for people wanting to bike along or across State Route 28 that bisects it. The Google images show a couple of people riding along different sections of that highway during the time the imaging car passed. Ultimately, we determined that place boundaries were better able to capture communities. The boundaries of census-designated places, cities, and towns are both easier for people to understand and more likely to capture the kinds of land uses that make walking and biking attractive, such as stores, schools, or even a roller skating center indicated by the red arrow here. Census-designated places do not have legally defined boundaries, but their margins are recognized nonetheless, and Washington's Office of Financial Management keeps data on these communities. The names of many census-designated places are as readily recognizable as some cities and towns, such as Quilcene, for example. Some, like Spanaway, are larger than small cities. Some have recently become cities, such as Spokane Valley, and others are in the process of doing so. But incorporation is much more difficult today than it was past. So many communities will remain census-designated places under the leadership of their respective counties. Here, we look at applying the population center idea to intersection need. With the transportation system historically focused on moving motorists, determining statewide system needs for walking and biking can become unmanageably large, and the message of need can become diluted. Using population center boundaries, and gaps identified through level of traffic stress analysis enabled us to focus need determination. Here is an example of a high traffic stress crossing on Aurora in Seattle. Notice the beautiful new curb ramps to facilitate the 7-lane, 40-mile-per-hour high traffic volume crossing. No crossing enhancements are present. In this context, we would have a choice to go up or down a block or two for a better crossing opportunity, such as at a signal. Other communities may have less traffic and less lanes, but fewer choices. Once again, limiting the estimation of statewide need to population centers helps us focus the message on places that people understand, where the distances between destinations are more walkable and bikeable. Even with such a focus, the statewide need is great, and of course, the price tag to address it is formidable. Bridges are another category of need that benefit from using a population center focus. Instead of declaring that almost all bridges are deficient for walking and biking, we concentrated on those that are both in a population center and were on an identified traffic stress gap. Using our agency's bridge data and applying sidewalk and shoulder criteria, we used GIS to estimate statewide bridge improvement needs. Here is an illustration of what can be done when level of traffic stress is visualized in terms of population centers and other data sets. In this slide, the dots represent transit stops associated with these city and census designated place population centers. The colored lines are population center gap segments, purple for urban and green for rural. Here, the gaps have not been cut by the population center boundaries. It is interesting to note that Burbank and other population centers do not appear to be served by fixed route transit, and people living there may also be having difficulty getting around on foot or by bike. As a last look at population centers, I wanted to point out that new data analysis techniques such as the level of traffic stress can highlight statewide needs for data. One weakness of our level of traffic stress analysis was a lack of sidewalk data. The pandemic stay-at-home order gave us a unique opportunity to use some of our agency's capacity to visually scan and record the presence of sidewalk within population center boundaries. The work is ongoing, but 405 miles of sidewalk on state roadways and population centers were identified so far. That means that about 24% of the state roadways within the population center boundaries have some sidewalk. Much of that sidewalk may be key areas of those population centers, instead of along farm fields, for example. So the 24% number is actually encouraging. Note, however, the quality and completeness of the sidewalk is not known. In some cases, we had data, but it was not used in the analysis for various reasons. Traffic volumes and roadway width were not used in our population center analysis. Going forward, we hope to use the new sidewalk data and incorporate other data sources into future analysis efforts to get a better picture of level of traffic stress in those population centers. As Kim discussed, we computed level of traffic stress for all state highways. We used a somewhat different criteria where non-population center contexts were exhibited around the state, but we still identified gaps there. You might have noticed her map that just showed gaps all over the state. However, it was not always clear that the locations we called a gap need attention more than the locations that were not gaps. Consider that all of these locations have posted speeds of 45 miles per hour or greater. The images show two different high-speed locations on US 101 that are open to bicycle use. One is high volume with wide shoulders and rumble strips. The other is low volume with minimal shoulder. Where would you rather ride? Where would you be objectively safer? At this point, we determined that we're not ready to estimate need for the rural high-speed context. We definitely recognize it, but each situation is nuanced. Planning should consider the interaction between travel purpose, potential demand, and available facilities, which include local system roadways. Investment must consider other factors too, such as equity. Thousands of miles of high-speed routes can gobble up active transportation dollars very quickly. So a strategy must be developed. That strategy will need to look at state and local facilities as a single system. It is difficult to meaningfully improve on what you don't measure. What recognizes performance metrics as a key element to our agency's success. Level of traffic stress has given us a new set of performance metrics that can help move us forward. Here, I have summarized some of the measures proposed in the draft Active Transportation Plan. As a state agency, we look at the facilities we manage, but the solutions are likely found in partnerships, which I will discuss in an upcoming slide. In terms of a baseline, we currently have a little over 130 miles of bike lane out of about 1,700 highway miles in population centers. We identified approximately 50 miles of low-stress highway near our modal connections, such as transit centers or ferries. And we have about 6,000 intersection gaps in population centers, plus another 1,000 highway ramp intersections to look at. 2 other recommended performance measures will be discussed in the next slide that deal with highway crossing availability. Kim briefly talked about WSDOT's highway crossing availability study, as it is very much related to level of traffic stress. The study evaluated route directness for people who need to reach destinations across state highways. As depicted here, we hypothesized that out of direction travel plus high traffic stress leads to low active travel trip making. Here, a happy face means low traffic stress. In quadrant A, the trip is both direct and low stress. In B and C, there are either stress issues or out of the way travel concerns that make a car trip seem much more appealing if you have a car. D offers a potential solution. Solutions might include improving the quality of existing direct crossings or working with partners to establish new shorter routes to existing direct crossings, or in the most expensive case, building new crossings. 2 performance metric recommendations came out of the crossing availability study. The first is simply to identify how far apart low stress crossings are. Whether or not people can make relatively direct and low stress trips between destinations within their communities. The metrics seem straightforward, but there's still some work to do on establishing a baseline and likely some very heavy lifting to do regarding establishing a goal. As you can imagine, there are significant implications to stating that low stress crossings will be spaced X feet apart. We know we can't build pedestrian bridges everywhere, and that such bridges are not even effective solutions in all cases. But we need to have the hard discussions if we are to advance active transportation meaningfully. Earlier, with respect to high-speed facilities, we discussed the idea that state highways and local routes must both be considered when recommending improvements for active transportation. The same is true for population centers. In this hypothetical scenario, we see a couple of state routes and a local roadway. The state routes have been evaluated for level of traffic stress. The pink color signifies that we have identified a gap on the state route, and the black is a no bikes or pedestrian zone, so also a gap. In panel B, we see the many reasons people want and need to be here: housing, food, shopping, and school. Panel C shows generalized arrows that represent travel needs in this area. Essentially, people have a travel need to go north-south or east-west. What panel C suggests is that the north-south travel need could be fulfilled by either the state route or the local roadway. Which should it be? In terms of access to destinations, the local route looks to be the better option, yet often it is anything but low traffic stress. Addressing active transportation means investing in the whole system, not just the parts of a given jurisdiction is responsible for. Partnerships and flexible funding are the key to making quality walking and biking available to everyone. So what's next? We've already begun a project aimed at refining our new active transportation data and determining how it can be integrated into the decision-making process at WSDOT. And of course, we are hard at work with the Active Transportation Plan and eager to get it out for public comment as soon as possible. Level of traffic stress is on the data end of a potentially much larger set of next steps that our agency is working towards as we speak. We are endeavoring to establish a true multimodal policy, in contrast to our more car-centric policies that will guide all our efforts and investments. Related to that idea, we are exploring multimodal level of service as a way of measuring our success with serving walkers, bike riders, transit users, freight operators, and drivers. With speed management, we are looking at setting speeds to match a context and supporting those speeds through roadway design, rather than focusing on speeds most people prefer to drive. There are many other good ideas moving forward at WSDOT, and too little time to bring them all forward here. But in keeping with the theme of this Walk, Bike, and Roll Summit, I want to end by highlighting the agency's efforts to advance equity and how we prioritize investments. In addition to serving all modes, our agency understands the need to serve all people, and with a clear understanding that equity is not equality. Thank you.
Okay, I guess that means I'm up. Can everybody hear me okay? Thumbs up maybe? Okay. All right, well, I'm already on the second slide. I'll jump right in here. I'm Chris Comeau from the City of Bellingham, City Transportation Planner. And here in Bellingham, we've done quite a bit with our bicycle network. I'm just gonna give you kind of a high level portrayal of where we're at, what we've done, and where we're headed. We were fortunate enough to create a bicycle master plan in 2013 and 14. Took us about 18 months, and our focus was on connectivity. And I'll walk you through our network analysis here. Just for those who aren't familiar with Bellingham, we're a city approaching 100,000 people. We're a university town. We're also the regional center, as you can see on the slide here. We get a disproportionate number of vehicles coming in and out of this city. And that's a good thing in one sense, because it really helps contribute to our local economy in terms of sales tax generation, which is a big deal for us. And that's really where our dedicated funding comes from for non-motorized transportation. Now let's see here. I want to advance my slide. Uh-oh. Okay, there we go. So what we've done citywide, both Brian and Kim mentioned a moment ago, multimodal policies and kind of the approach that different places can take. We've definitely had a multimodal transportation policy in place for many years, about 15 years or so. We've modeled our planning after many of the more progressive cities in the United States, Portland, Seattle, et cetera. And what we're trying to do, though, is we're trying to balance our transportation system for all users. We're really trying to create a people-focused transportation system, not just for cars, but anybody who needs to get around. And we're very focused on trying to provide safety and comfort for the most vulnerable users of the network, but we cannot forget that the network has to work for everybody. So this is kind of the philosophy that we have. And let me show you some examples. As I mentioned, we were fortunate enough to create a bicycle master plan in 2014. We've also created a pedestrian master plan in 2012. And we've been fortunate enough to have an extensive multi-use greenways trail system in Bellingham. That is supported by a property tax levy that's been renewed 4 different times. Our pedestrian and bicycle master plans are supported by a dedicated funding source called the Transportation Fund, which is actually on the November 3rd ballot and the general election. And we're very hopeful that that gets renewed. That is what provides the funding for us to make all of the progress that we've made. So from a network standpoint, now diving into the bicycle master plan, in looking at trying to create a citywide bicycle network, the first thing we wanted to do was assess the demand. Where do people want to go? We used a number of different techniques and a number of different opportunities for public input, surveys, online interactive maps where people could literally show us where they were riding or where they wanted to ride. We took it out to neighborhood meetings, public open houses. We had a dedicated steering committee for both the pedestrian and bicycle master plans. And these were representatives from various interest groups around the city, as well as internal city departments like police, fire, emergency medical responders. We based a lot of what we were doing on our multimodal policy approach and our comprehensive plan. And the fact that from the land use side, we here in Bellingham have created urban village plans. And these are mixed use centers, much like the stuff that's been done in Seattle and Portland, places where you've got more complete bicycle pedestrian networks and high frequency transit. And so if you look at the map, you can see that we had about 30 key destinations throughout the city in every neighborhood. And we used that as kind of the magnets to draw people in terms of where people are wanting to go. And from that, we developed a draft bicycle network that we then took out at public meetings and showed to everybody and asked them to respond to. And in the end, this became our recommended bicycle network. And it's got a wide variety of bicycle facility types shown here in various colors. I will just point out a few things. For instance, since we're talking about level of traffic stress, and we'll get to that in a moment, 31% of our planned bicycle network is on bicycle boulevards, shown in pink on the map. So that's a pretty big chunk of our network as low stress. They're residential streets, low volume, low speed, very comfortable for bike riding, and they connect, of course, to bike lanes on arterial streets. And then we've got a variety of different type of dedicated bicycle facilities on our arterial network. And almost all of our arterial streets are represented in the bicycle network. So we've got pretty amazing coverage in terms of overall citywide network. The next step was to get into the level of traffic stress. And we were doing this in 2013 and 14. So there was not as much guidance as there is today, but we based it on methodology from the Mineta Transportation Institute. And we put quite a lot into it. We customized it for our own purposes, but we looked at a number of different things, including volumes and speeds, slopes. We've got a variety of terrain here in Bellingham, a lot of places where people are expected to ride uphill. When we looked at prioritizing our network, we emphasized social equity and employment centers, as well as transit routes and transit dependency. But overall, as I said, we were really focused on connectivity, making sure that when we created a network, it was getting people to the places that they said that they wanted to go. The way that we prioritized our network then was using a connectivity analysis using some proprietary software that Transpo Group developed called Velocity. And this slide just kind of shows you that on the left, prior to incorporating or implementing any of the recommendations in the Bicycle Master Plan, you see a slide in the center of Bellingham. This is the Roosevelt and Sunnyland neighborhoods before there were bicycle facilities installed. And then one of the first bicycle boulevards that we installed that actually allowed people to get across I-5 resulted in a significant change in the mobility connectivity for these people who lived along this bicycle boulevard. And that's the whole idea here. This is all based on route directness index that you just heard Kim and Brian talk about. And then on the right, you can see the fully implemented bicycle network and how that changes the mobility connectivity for people living in these areas to get across mobility barriers like Interstate 5 and other major streets like Alabama Street in Bellingham. And so this was an incredibly helpful thing for us to try to look at the user benefit from these network connections. So the next step was actually prioritizing our individual bicycle network projects. We had a list of 186 projects, and we had to figure out, okay, how are we going to decide which one of these we should look at first? What's the priority? And these are all the variables that went into that. We've already talked about a number of them, but then in the end, we came up with a network prioritization score, and that then kind of ranked our project list. And what we ended up with is a total of 106 total network link projects. There's about 28 crossing improvements as well, but 21 of those network links were listed as further study needed. And I've highlighted a few of them, Lakeway Drive in particular, because I want to relate this to what you heard from both Kim and Brian in terms of the state highway system. In Bellingham, we've definitely labeled some of the state highways and bigger roads in Bellingham as mobility barriers. And we'll get to that in just a moment. But I wanted to focus on Lakeway Drive in particular. Using the velocity connectivity analysis on the right, you can see the change from having no bicycle facilities on Lakeway Drive to actually implementing what's recommended in the bicycle plan, getting bicycle facilities on this corridor, whether they're on street or adjacent to the street in a shared use kind of facility or protected facility. And again, looking at our demand key destination map, clearly I-5 is a mobility barrier for people to get from the east side of the freeway into our downtown area. So it's a major destination and a major link. In fact, it was ranked number 2 out of the entire list of 186 projects. So we've studied how to do this one time with our Lakeway Drive bicycle study in 2016 and 17. We were not able to reach an agreed upon solution getting under I-5. We had some ideas, and you can see some of those below here on the screen. These are conceptual, but we really think that we're moving close to getting a solution. On the left, you can see that these are standard 5-foot marked bike lanes. This is a very busy street with about 26,000 vehicles a day going underneath I-5 here on Lakeway Drive. And it's probably not going to be the type of facility that's going to make people feel safe or comfortable or attract a lot of riders. However, if we look on the right, there may be an easy way to create a protected bicycle facility, a shared use facility, making use of the existing sidewalk and then converting that into what we'll just call a multi-use pathway, at least underneath the freeway, to remove the barrier and allow people a way to get under the freeway and into the downtown in a safe and comfortable manner. We're not there yet. This is just one piece on a lengthy corridor that's an incredibly expensive project to undertake. But this is the one kind of linchpin, the bottleneck, if you will, of what we're trying to solve. So while we've done one study, we did not solve the problem. We're doing another study, the Lincoln Lakeway Multimodal Transportation Study. And by the way, these highlights in blue are all links to studies on our city web pages. You can see here, we've got I-5, and on the graphic on the right, you can clearly see that both Lakeway and I-5 are labeled as mobility barriers. And that's what we're trying to break down, is that barrier. Get people across the freeway. So that's the purpose of this study. In white outlined here, and I don't know if you can see my cursor, but in white outlined here is our Samish Maple Ellis improvements. I'm very happy to say that, first of all, we spent several years looking at this 1.5 mile corridor. We've planned and designed bicycle facilities. We were fortunate enough to have DOT fund these with a pedestrian bicycle safety grant. And this morning, we have removed vehicle lanes, and this morning they're putting down the markings for the new robust buffered bike lanes on this corridor. It's one of our urban villages. Like I said, it's 1.5 mile corridor, goes into our downtown area. And on the graphic, you can see the network connectivity that we've created over the past 6 years. It's extensive, and this is another really key piece in that network. We've done a lot up here in Bellingham. We hope to do more, but we have to have the funding to do that, and that's an important thing. Another thing that's important in doing this work is to make sure that you let the public and your decision makers know what's going on and what kind of progress you're making. So each year we publish a report and we show everybody exactly how much progress we've made, how much the network has grown, how many projects we've been able to build. In our transportation report on annual mobility, and that's on our city web pages as well. I do want to show you exactly what we've been able to do. We're fortunate enough to have, we passed a transportation benefit district measure in 2010. So we've had dedicated funding for non-motorized transportation projects. That expires at the end of this year though. So hopefully it will be renewed by the voters on November 3rd, but we shall see. We have been very fortunate to see the network grow over the last 10 years, and that's what I'm walking you through here. The purple that you'll see on this map is that dedicated funding that I mentioned a moment ago, the transportation fund that we hope gets renewed. And you can see how extensive the networks have gotten from both the pedestrian and the bicycle side of things, and how important this money has been for us over the years. And we really hope that we can continue this progress, but without that funding, that is very unlikely. I'm also very happy to report that from a social equity standpoint, because we very purposely and strategically built this as one of our most important variables into our project prioritization, on the pedestrian side of things, 69% of our projects have been in low-income neighborhoods. On the bicycle side of things, over 75% of our projects have been in low-income neighborhoods in Bellingham. And again, that was purposeful, it was strategic. It's because we prioritized that as one of the variables when we went to go rank the project list. So when we pick our projects, it's kind of already baked into the rankings that we're going to be able to provide more bang for the buck in these areas. Anyway, that is essentially what I have to share with you this morning, and that's the end of the presentation. So I guess we're going to go into our Q&A session now.
And yes, we are, and I had to do things in 3 places, so love the technology. So we've had some great discussion in the chat box along the way, and I want to pick up on one point, Kim, and I saw you responding to it, but I think it's worth unpacking a bit. When we look at the network and look at intersections and assume they function, even if they're low LTS, are they fully optimized? Is there enough signal crossing time? Especially if you had a place where you have more older people or more people with disabilities there who might need longer crossing time, you can adjust signal timing. So maybe among the 3 of you, and Chris, I don't know if this is something that got factored in as you looked at your network, but intersections, how do we make intersections work better for everybody? Can the chicken cross the road? Does the chicken want to cross the road at the place where you want the chicken to cross the road?
Exactly. Sometimes I feel like I'm the chicken trying to cross the road. The intersections are problematic whenever we do a level of traffic stress, and that is often related to the level of detail required to really understand how intersections function at that very specific level. Oftentimes, a level of traffic stress can give you like a high level understanding of how it's going to work, but almost always you're going to need a more detailed site visit to understand what exactly is going on. And that's one of the issues that we were looking at in both the multimodal study and the active transportation plan development is and really framing how intersections work. And both the link and node studies that we did are a great first pass, and they can help you understand where to focus, but they're not a substitute for on-the-ground corridor analysis.
I could add to that, just looking at the data that came out of this, we could point to this is a high level of traffic stress intersection at a given location in the state. And yet if we were talking to the local agency, they might say, but this isn't where everybody's trying to cross. Here's the preferred network that we have. We want to get between these destinations. So even though you're saying that this other intersection is, from a data standpoint, somewhat lower traffic stress, it's actually fairly high traffic stress because everybody wants to be there. And maybe all the drivers are there too. And yes, it's signalized, but we're actually seeing more of our crashes there. So there's a lot of things that could end up factoring in when you decide. You can't just use level of traffic stress to say, we're fixing that road, we're fixing that intersection. It brings you into the area and gets you evaluating all of the intersections in that area and how people are moving. What is their network, as Chris was looking at? What's the connectivity that you're after?
I would say that here in Bellingham, one of the things that we're doing, you saw that we had a bunch of the further study needed corridors. I didn't really explain that. The further study needed category was for places where we did not feel comfortable at the time making a recommendation for a type of bicycle facility. Therefore, that merited further study. And so when we do those, like the Lincoln Lakeway multimodal study, we're looking at not just the corridor, but all the intersections along the corridor and how we can try to make those safer for both pedestrians and bicyclists. I will just say, though, kind of tagging on to what Kim was saying a moment ago, you know, intersections are the conflict point for all modes: vehicles, buses, pedestrians, and bicycles. They're always problematic. They're always the bottleneck. There are some tools that are starting to become available for, you know, looking at those. And again, when you are trying to look at safety for people, that's a very important thing. If you can try to design for the most vulnerable users, hopefully that means higher level of safety for everybody using the intersection. But it is complicated, and all of these things are bloody expensive. And so there's a big difference between drawing a bunch of lines on a map and conducting studies and determining feasibility, and then actually finding the funding to do a lot of these improvements, some of which are really, really expensive and take a lot of time to complete.
Barb, just to follow on there, if someone is looking for more detailed intersection analysis tools, I would use the HCM MMLOS Pedestrian Environmental Quality Index, the PEQI, is another one that comes to mind. And ODOT, and that's the Oregon Department of Transportation, has a really robust network analysis tool with their LTS.
Great. And Kim, if you happen to be able to find those links and pop them into the chat, that would be great.
Let me see what I can do here.
Yeah, and which lets me then bounce back to Chris in particular, but I think Brian might also want to talk about the topic of trails, because Bellingham has, I've gotten to ride them, such great trails that serve as a piece of your transportation system, even soft surface trails in some locations, and talking about their value in that urban setting. And then Brian might, I'm watching the time here, very briefly describe our statewide bikeways network concept in the Active Transportation Plan as another way of characterizing a network need. So Chris, Bellingham Trail.
Yeah, so like I said, we are very fortunate to have an extensive multi-use trail system here. We've actually evaluated our trail system to determine how much of it is truly what we call bicycle friendly, and it's about 2/3 of the system. And that had to do with trail width, the kind of surfacing, the slopes, and things like that. We do consider it part of our secondary portion of our transportation system. The reason for that is it's not as direct, but it's much more comfortable for a lot of people to get to different places. Much more leisurely pace. They go out of the way, but they can eventually get you to where you want to go. But a lot of the destinations happen to be on the arterial street network. So that's where our on-street bicycle system is much more effective if that's, you know, your desire is to get to where you want to go. But we're very fortunate. There's a ton of public support for those, and we do recognize and incorporate it into our overall transportation planning.
I'm glad you made that point, Chris, about trails are not necessarily connected to the destinations. And we've had those conversations in our regions as well, that, you know, there's this great facility over there, but it's a half a mile away. And, you know, the stores and things that people want to get to are right there on the arterials. But trails do have that function of sort of acting as the highway system for people walking and maybe biking and maybe walking as well, for going longer distances. And we began to collect as much trail data as we can of existing trails around the state. That's much harder than you'd think. And then trying to identify ones that would serve a transportation function rather than just a recreation function. And we identified a fairly large network of these trails that go into the billions of dollars of assets statewide of existing trail. And then we started thinking about in our plan, what would we need to connect these? What sort of trail might the state be partnering in designing so that you can actually connect communities for those people who do want to go longer distances between communities? Currently, your option is to be out there on the highway, like the one behind me, which is just beautiful, but look at those shoulders. I rode that during COVID when everything was closed. It was amazing, but you just normally never have that opportunity. So where can we build trails to connect trails? So the communities have their trail systems, and then it's like a staged thing. So you want to go from community A to community B, you need the regional trail. And then once you get into community B, you need that on-street network in order to get to the destinations there, that hotel you're staying at, or the Safeway that has the food to resupply you.
Sorry, my unmute wasn't working there for a minute. Yeah, and I might add, to put this in context, because we had to do a statewide needs assessment in our active transportation plan, and you'll get the chance to comment on the draft. And Chris mentioned some of this is expensive. When you put it in the context of other kinds of facilities, though, I'll give you the number we came up with for a statewide bike network. And I say bike network because we think that long haul trip, if you're going to walk across the state, more power to you, but we did plan in terms of bike networks. So connecting existing trails, planned trails, and the in-between connections to go through population centers. If we wanted to do that, if we took the cost of one urban interchange per biennium, we could have that whole network in less than 10 years. So yes, they're expensive because they're not there yet, but expensive relative to other infrastructure, not quite so much. So I leave it to those of you who are interested in that happening to talk to those who apportion the budget, as Secretary Millar talked about yesterday. We as an agency spend the money where we're directed to spend the money. And so does RCO when they invest in trails, or Transportation Improvement Board. That board makes decisions, but they're not investing in trails. So just a little food for thought to look ahead. I want us to talk about the accessibility of the network we're creating. We've had questions coming in about making sure that a leading pedestrian interval has the audible signal if you're a blind or low vision pedestrian needing to cross, those kinds of factors. So anything you can share about either how that was part of the assessment. I know Brian will tell you we didn't have enough data to do everything we want to do on that point, but Chris, how did that factor into your planning? And Kim, if you've got some national best practices to recommend for people to think about accessible active transportation.
Oh, well, I'll jump in. We've got both a pedestrian master plan and a bicycle master plan, and we're certainly addressing the accessibility issues in both. We're also just about nearing the end of creation of an ADA transition plan. So these will all get wrapped together when we do projects, whether it started out as a bicycle, we always try to look to make sure everything that's needed gets put into the corridor at the same time. We will certainly be, trying to look for opportunities to improve accessibility for all users, both vision impaired people as well as hearing impaired people. And now with ADA requirements, you can't touch, traffic signal without making sure it's up to standard and making sure it has the things that people need to cross safely. So when we do our projects, we make sure that all of those features are included.
From a data-driven standpoint, the best analysis framework for accessibility, I think, would be the ODOT TGM manual, which I put a link in the chat for. The FHWA guidebook for multimodal connectivity, measuring multimodal connectivity, has a case study as well. It considers several different pedestrian level of service metrics and visualizes a network in Baltimore using a safety-focused metric, a ADA-focused metric, and one other one I can't remember off the top of my head. I think it's just presence, absence of sidewalk. So you can see how different analysis tools give you a different vision of the pedestrian environment. And two things like APIs and leading pedestrian intervals. The best way I have seen those included so far is through policy. I have not seen a data repository or data store that is robust enough and contains those systematically in a way that I would feel comfortable evaluating. So I think that's where it would be. As more data is needed if you want to do a systemic evaluation.
And I just remembered a project, I'll find the link and drop it into the chat, the Open Sidewalks project in Seattle, and I don't know if Kim's familiar with that, yeah. Anat Caspi at UW has been working with a team to characterize really the trip planning element. And I mean, and given Seattle's topography, I think one of the interesting things is she's factoring in how steep is it to get up Cherry Street in downtown Seattle? If you are in a wheelchair and you can roll into a publicly open building and use the elevator to go up 3 floors and out on the next street, you just took care of your elevation gain using the building systems. Like, what a creative way. That's only obviously available if the building is open, but really looking, how do you get from here to there? So I'll drop a link to that. I want to point you to 2 upcoming sessions since this topic is of interest. First is today's keynote at 12:30. Anna Ziverts with Rooted in Rights and Disability Rights Washington will be talking about accessibility and equity in transportation. And then Friday morning, we have a session where we'll be talking about pedestrian safety countermeasures for crossings. We have Peter Yoon from Federal Highways doing a training on the countermeasures. We have a pedestrian safety action plan, and I will drop that link as well. And we have Larry Watkinson with our Office of Equal Opportunity sharing his perspective. He is the person for us as an agency who oversees our ADA compliance. And Larry is himself blind, so his perspective of how can I cross successfully is really well informed. And so those are 2 sessions to watch for to get more on this. We've had some great questions and discussions coming in, the importance of wayfinding and signage and what else we can do, and several questions about the use of safety data and crash data. So I will just mention briefly, in our active transportation plan, after this network analysis, we're overlaying evaluation criteria based on the census block, similar to what Bellingham has done. And we're looking at the socioeconomic characteristics of the place, and we're overlaying crash data. And I wonder, any of you who want to talk more about, once you have characterized your network, then how do you factor in more safety information to prioritize? And maybe start with you, Chris.
So I'll just say here in Bellingham, we did incorporate the safety component into the level of traffic stress and the connectivity analysis. However, we go farther than that. Every year, we collect all the collision information and we look at our road safety plan. And we here in Bellingham, in typical fashion, in multimodal policy fashion, we are taking the lens of pedestrian and bicycle safety and using that to prioritize where on our network we see bicycle and pedestrian collisions, and we try to program our projects to try and alleviate any of those risks that are out on the network. So we're continuously doing this. It's not just a one-time thing that was done in the plan. We're monitoring what's going on. We're trying to make improvements to eliminate those risks. And we hope that we're going to be successful in creating a safe and comfortable system for people walking and biking. But there's lots of issues out there, conflicts, and you cannot predict human behavior. And hopefully we're going to see a lot less, but we're trying.
So safety data is a very large part of what we analyze and respond to at WSDOT. We have our grant programs have a large part of their prioritization comes with safety data. And so one of the things, though, that comes out of this level of traffic stress analysis, we did the level of traffic stress analysis. Here is a LTS4 location, and then we associated data with it. We associated equity data, we associated safety data, we associated connectivity data, so that we could potentially use that to help people prioritize where you wanted to look first. But it's also important to consider, and I think this really came out of the crossing availability route directness index discussion. Currently, you may have everybody converging on one spot. So clearly all your safety problems will occur there because everybody is there. All the drivers are there, the bicyclists, the walkers. And is anybody asking whether it's better to help develop a new spot that is something that's going to work better for the network? And because we have to recognize that we built the system for driving, and so we're funneling everybody to that those driving nodes. So that's coming out of our study now. Those questions are kind of early questions. We don't know where we're going with it yet, but we recognize that a complete accessible network is probably a safer network as well.
Kim, any thoughts you want to add?
You were muted, Barb.
I didn't think I was. That's weird. I was just seeing if Kim had anything she wanted to chime in on. We're about right near the time we wanted to wrap up, and there are such great questions we couldn't links to harvest from here, and I think those go in sort of the show notes when the archive is made available as well. So many good ideas. We clearly need to do this again in future. And with that, let's see, I'm just looking to see, yeah, we do need networks. It's all about the network. It's just all about the network. So with that, I think we'll go ahead and wrap up, let you get on your way, start the rest of your day full of ideas for how to reduce stress in your life and the lives of others on the network. Take care, take that feedback form, and come back at 12:30 for a wonderful talk by Anna. Thanks.
Thank you, everybody.